So for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last couple of decades, let me tell you about Viktor Koen. He holds a BFA from the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem, an MFA in illustration from the School of Visual Arts, where he is now an esteemed faculty member, and founder of the Summer Illustration Residency Program. If you think you're not familiar with his work, think again. You've seen it everywhere. Everywhere. You've seen it in the subways, the iconic posters for SVA, some of which you see right here, and you've seen his work in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and it goes on and on and on. Victor's had over 40 one-man shows. Probably by the time I finish reading this, he'll have had 50 in galleries and museums all over the world. And last Friday, just when I thought that I had this introduction all wrapped up, he called me and told me that he had just gotten the Educator of the Year award from 3x3 magazine. Congratulations. So why am I introducing Viktor, you might ask? Because over 20 years ago, I was designing book covers, and I had a really weird fiction series that I needed an illustrator to bail me out on. So I consulted my husband, Stephen Heller, for his opinion. He sent me his then student, Viktor Koen, and he did bail me out. And about 10 years ago, when I was looking for new studio space, I found myself at the Foundry building, which is on East 23rd Street, right near SVA. And it also happens to be where Viktor just happens to live and work. And my one takeaway from this is that everyone should have a Greek neighbor. Viktor brings me regular deliveries of Kalamata olives, and when his mother is in town, like now, he brings me freshly made baklava. So I'm looking forward to that. And in between all of that, we get to talk about typography. But he has more to say about that to you tonight. So my only part of the bargain is that I send up gelato whenever I get a delivery from my client. So it evens out. Gelato and olives, and well, baklava. So, and I also promised to do this introduction. So I now present Viktor Koen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming in the first terrible night of the year. I really appreciate it. But I know better than to cancel an event like this just because of snow. So we're here, and that's what counts. Now, the exhibition is called Phenotypes, and this is a weird term to name a typography and illustration lecture or exhibition. And it really hurts when you're someone that comes out with like 3 puns per sentence and you cannot come up with a name for your exhibition. But thankfully, I have a brilliant genetic biologist in my home that has inspired me towards the sciences that I also visually have to do a lot with, even though I was terrible in sciences at school. And we got phenotypes. Now, what is a phenotype? Is the composite of an organism's observable characteristics and expression of its genetic code, as well as the influence of environmental factors and interactions of the two. So the interesting thing about this little presentation is that I will be talking about these genetic characteristics and the environment, so we'll hopefully explain whatever you're looking at around you. Now, why was it named Phenotypes? Phenotypes in a free Greek translation means it looks like type. And that's what I do. It's not type, it looks like type. Typography is a very exact science, and I really don't deserve to be included in this. I snuck in through the back door in here. And hopefully this lecture will also answer two of the questions that are lingering in everyone's mind right now. Number one, what is an illustrator doing at the Type Directors Club? And number two, out of all illustrators, why did it have to be this one? This is really a pair of images that I put in every presentation to prove that at some point in the past, I kind of knew how to draw. And I throw this in, but this is pretty much standard academic drawing and painting for every person that gets prepared for the Academy of Fine Arts to go in Athens. So it's very standard classic Greek education. I did not get accepted, and then had to move to the Patel Academy of Arts and Design that thankfully accepted me. Now this is a sample of my thesis project after my BFA in design. There was no illustration department then, and I'm again thankful for this, because even though I had to take every single elective in illustration, I got a really robust understanding, appreciation, flair for the art of typography. In the last year, right before graduation, the right person put the right book in my hands, and that's the graphic language of Neville Brody that had a direct and catalytic impact on the way I designed and still design, I guess, and this is obvious from these spreads. It was a contemporary Greek mythology magazine. I picked 6 myths. I connected them with contemporary text, and each one of them had a page that was completely typographical and one that had an illustration. What you're looking at is really a manual collage photocopied on acid paper and then painted underneath and over with acrylic paint. Then I came to the MFA at the School of Visual Arts, started studying with Marshall Arisman, and these are the paintings that I made in the first winter break of school. The first semester was a disaster as I was trying to find my voice. But then I guess I figured out that the dark, apocalyptic sense of the city had an impact, and it just washed away all the Greek sun out of my skin. And then this is what New York City looked like to me, but it infused really bright color, a direction, and I guess this is when the darkness won over me instead of the light. This is my thesis project for the MFA. My instructor was Mirko Illich. I chose an art director instead of an illustrator. And then eventually this became also my first published piece at the New York Times. Thank you, Mirko. He kept my thesis project. He said, we will publish something from here. So I had to run downstairs the next morning to buy the paper to see which piece was eventually published. This is the artwork that I used to do at that point in time. The series is called The Body Parts Catalog, because in a futuristic world, and we might not be very far from it, we will be able to buy body parts to fix ourselves just like we buy toner for a printer. So this is what I did, and then this led to the New York Times, the letter section, that 2x2 size illustration. Jarell Krause was the art director. She took me in, and if people don't know, this is usually a 24-hour deadline. You're gonna come back with sketches, and then you come up with the finish. So this is what they kind of looked like. I did this very intensely, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week, from 94 to 95. And at the same time, that's the kind of work I did in my legitimate job at Ogilvy and Mather Direct. Look how psyched that kid in the pool is. That's not how I felt at that environment, even though I was getting my work published, at least at the Times. 2 years later, I get hired by Marvel Comics to be an art director for the promotional department that just opened. I got a design and assign the first MasterCard. I design a lot of collectibles. I redesign all their stationery system, and we just look at the Spider-Man one, but X-Men and the Fantastic Four had their own stationery, so we had to do all of this, and was really trying to design Marvel in a non-Marvel way. So that was very exciting. It lasted for 2 years, and it was a dream job. We would be done at the last moment that FedEx would accept our packages to send them out to clients. So it was a lot of late nights pitching to no end, and a lot of the things kind of came out to fruition. At the same time, I started building my vocabulary, but I also started building my clientele. After Marvel Comics, I became a creative partner at a very small design studio called LPNY Thing, where I stayed for 5 years, and that's exactly what I said I would stay for. And then I kind of left to pursue a completely illustration career. So after the newspapers came the magazines, more magazines, this is more recent work, came the many spots, and I just picked some latest work because the work is actually still evolving, especially as far as color goes. Came the book covers, and you see very conveniently over here I can point at one of the 3 Billy Verite covers that I did for Louise. Some licensing work for snowboards or accoutrements for technology. Eventually also doing work for the music industry. Eminence is the biggest heavy metal band in Brazil right now, so designing the stage backgrounds, the CDs and merchandising for them. We actually just finished something new as well. And then the project kind of became larger. I started doing design for the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, a fantastic client that allowed the work to actually reach new levels. On the other side is Photoville, a big project related to the best photo festival we have in New York, doing the design and promotion for it year after year. And this is new work, the new Photoville campaign that you might have seen in September. And on the other side is a philanthropy poster exhibition that I assigned to my SVA students and eventually take the best 24 pieces for the Stavros Niarchos conference in Athens. And then this is an architectural, almost design project. It's the mural for a room that houses the Spiros Lewis Cup. It's the first marathon runners cup from 1896, the first Olympics in Athens. And it's in this gorgeous building. This room is exactly here. If you ever visit Athens, please do not neglect to go by that place. It houses the National Opera House and the Greek Public Library. But lately I've been doing a lot of work with TV and movies, and especially posters for festivals, conferences, series and documentaries. And finally, some typography in illustration. Now, the art director for this series of pieces for Bloomberg Personal, Frank Tagriel, happens to be in the room. And you see actually numbers got kind of stuck into someone's head. And this was the first kind of experiment with typography and illustration that I ever had to do. And I have to say that quite a few, since this was a very consistent series, we were doing one piece every month. These pieces were illustrating Michael Bloomberg's editorial piece in the magazine itself until he became the mayor and could not actually carry on with his position. So I was the only person that lost in these elections. We had to stop, but we actually did 5 years times 12, if my math is correct. That's about 60 pieces that we did. A few years later, I revisit the concept, but it becomes way moodier, and the character becomes more aloof. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what it happened. But it also brings an era of fuller backgrounds in my illustration. And then I will start showcasing the legitimate usages of typography in illustration, because type in illustration is kind of a taboo. You can be really using the old canon of caricature where you show a big monster and you write the word that describes the monster on the actual monster. You're not supposed to say and show the same thing, but there are some things that you cannot avoid, and one of them is the writing or signing hand that does this thing. We have my obsession with question marks, and this was an article about cutting down on salt. Oh look, more question marks. For Golf Digest, I never golfed, but they were very kind to give me a whole slew of assignments, and the genetic tree from Baseline magazine. Then we have the usage of the typewriter keys. The large piece, the Turing's Delirium, is featuring an Enigma machine, and this is the British machine that broke the Nazi code, especially in submarine warfare. I could not find a place to photograph an Enigma machine. They are mostly housed in a small barn out of London, and at some point I thought of flying to London and coming in within a day with photographs of the Enigma machine. But I found blueprints of the Enigma machine online, and then I built a fictitious one. Since then, every museum I go to has 6 Enigma machines. So I have plenty of photography if we need to. Completely different usage on the side that was a cover for the book review at the New York Times. We thought of doing something a little more elaborative with Steve, but at some point I came up with this colorful solution for the keys by themselves, and we use them just as you see them here. Then we have this medical X-ray usage of typography, and it's this really fake scientific type that is within the X-rays, and we see the a tricorder on one side, and on the other side a piece for Scientific American. Talking about science, this was another kind of Big Bang illustration that we were doing when we're using typography as an effect in an overlaid abundance of complex and very confusing typography and data, but we went with something a little more tame, and the only thing you can see is binary code in the rings around that hole in the sky. Then we have the abstract qualities of typography, when typography is not really used to be read, but it's used as a frame or as a shape into posters configurations. Then we have the t-shirt. If you put typography on a t-shirt, that makes it legitimate. And then the anarchy sign for the Village Voice, remember the Village Voice cover? It was great, always working for them. And this is Mutant Bike Gangs of New York. It must have been a very slow news day that day, and we went for these bike gangs. And I actually had to create one of these very elaborate bicycles that you see sometimes in the streets, but I haven't seen many gangs since then. Then we have the neon configuration, and this is really pre-3D, so I had to run out and photograph neon and actually bend it to fit our projects. We have, for a couple of years, I put the Esquire logo on any surface they could actually come up with, again, using many layers, and I don't even remember how many cups of that coffee I had before I got the right one. Then we have the defacing of typography. On one hand, it's this dead-end concept for the Times, and on the other side is actually where the illustration actually defaces the headline of the magazine with a conceptual point. And following with the defacing, we kind of have this really weathered typography, and these are 2 bestsellers for Penguin. The funny thing with the mirror, with this chipping old mirror, is that when you're not looking for them, they're everywhere. Everyone is throwing them out, but you don't need them, so you don't take them. But when you need them, you cannot find them anywhere. So this comes from one of these weird little towns upstate New York where they have it's like 100 residents, but it's like 200 antique shops. And after I think a full weekend of looking around, found one of these. The chipping paint was done as in a painful way where every single chip is actually overlaying the real typography. Then we have effect typography, and that's a piece for Roadrunner Records. The band, don't look for it, it doesn't exist anymore. Mutiny within in an effect kind of related context in both cases. Then you have the labels, when you have to do mini graphic design within your illustration to actually convince people that these are real shipping labels. And then on the other side we have these very classic labels that people used to put on their suitcases. Then we have mathematical language in illustration, and there are countless mathematicians to try to figure out what the hell this means, but I copied and pasted different things, so it doesn't really mean anything. On the one hand is women in science, and on the other is the algorithm of love. It's out there, I warn you. And then we have the blueprints, and then we have the architectural language that actually get into things that kind of look like blueprints. And this is a concept where we can order our babies to include any appliance we want them to actually use, and we could also use them as a remote control. But it's not true, we're not there yet. And then we have dimensional typography, and this is old-fashioned type you can really hold and feel, that you find mostly in flea market, but you can also find in the Type Directors Club as a place that collects this kind of object. And talking about this, we also have a series of posters for the School of Visual Arts that is based also on the same base, but also on physical type that I actually photographed around the neighborhood at the School of Visual Arts. Most of these businesses don't exist now. So I don't really know if it's this Blade Runner curse that as soon as you make it known, it goes out of business, but they worked out really well for the posters in the subway. And then I call it the data rain, when you have something really, really complex and confusing. You just, and the lady in the bottom really expresses this. I use raining of typography from the top, and it kind of creates a visual effect. It expresses the confusion, and it actually works as shapes in space. Typography and tattooing. One piece is for Random House, the other one's for Hemispheres magazine. And then we have handwritten typography, and that's a favorite kind of story of mine. Obviously, when I did this cover, I never read a Harry Potter book or saw a movie, because this is obviously not the Harry Potter equipment that he uses to fly. That's not it. So when they called me a penguin, they asked me to actually create a rocket broom, something that would expose how that broom is actually functioning. And I don't really draft. I only build things out of Photoshop, so I took generators and turbo engines and put them together and melt them into this bionic piece of equipment. It was the holidays, I flew to Greece. They liked the sketch, but they said it should be a blueprint. It should not actually look like the thing itself. My father was an industrial engineer and a master draftsman. It was the holidays. I took a print. I said, "Dad, can you trace it and make it look like a blueprint? I'm sure you know how." He said, "That's perfect. I'm going tomorrow to work for the last time this year, and then I will do it for you." So he comes back that evening. He gives it to me. He said, "The entire design studio worked on this." I pull it out of the envelope. It looks nothing like I gave to him. So my heart is crushed, and I said, "But Dad, I can't use it because it doesn't look like what I gave to you." He said, "Yes, but this one can fly." So it was kind of a futile attempt to make an engineer fake something, and of course they tried to make something that would fly. But I did preserve, he actually made notes of proportions and numeric kind of calculations next to it, so I got to use his handwriting, because he had a really neat handwriting on the cover. The piece next to it is, we will connect to the cloud later. The next one, the title says, "Maybe it could be neurotic." So I thought that neurotic must be something that could be written with my left hand. So it looks very neurotic, and I hope it worked that way. Then we have explosive typography. We have syncing typography, and these are all made in Photoshop layer to layer. And then we go to straightforward illustrated typography. That is a piece about torture in the Village Voice. This is a cover for The Economist, bulletins from the future, and here's a guest starring, of course, the typewriter Lil Keys. And the very close relative to this is architectural dimensional typography, and these are some of the most elaborate and painful projects for anyone to go through. They look great at the end of the day, but they
they take much more than blood, sweat, and tears. Okay, they also raise your cholesterol levels and fat index. Finally, illustration and typography. Funny Farm, the Alphabet of Mental Disorders, and this is a funny little series that looked like that. And that's exactly how I continue painting. And this is 1997. But at some point I started being attracted to typography again, and this is when we started working at my little design studio with letterpress projects. I started sketching letter version for every mental illness. I took the alphabet, the book, the compendium of mental disorders. I chose one for each letter of the alphabet. I made my sketches. I made my composites with royalty-free, you know, those wonderful Dover publications, and scan them, and then I make notes, of course, to make things better if possible. And then this is what the final project looks like. And I have to admit that the actual font was not really calculated very deeply in the way that these letters will work, but at the end of the day, somehow they were made to work, and these are my three favorites, all mental illnesses that I possess and possess me. And this is the full font. In here we produced them in letterpress and created a really beautiful edition as a portfolio. This is actually also my first exhibition in Soho, and you can see that we exhibited the cuts, the paintings, and the actual letterpress print for each and every one of them. This is the cover of a fantastic avant-garde typography magazine out of Greece, and if you pay attention to Moth Girl, we also used it in one of our exhibitions a couple of years ago to illustrate the logo for Gone, written by Jack Ketchum, a very famous fiction author. He's standing in front of this vinyl display, including his name. Unfortunately, Jack passed away just a few months ago, so this is kind of a wish goodbye to him. And then we get to the Dark Peculiar Toys, the Mechanics of Joy. This is what the toys look like, a really kind of popping, colorful, and happy series, if that was ever possible. This is what these pieces look like in several galleries exhibited, including United Photo Industries' big Defense Project, and this went around the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge on the Brooklyn side for, I think, more than a full year. And then Toyfabet is the byproduct of all that series. There were small pieces left behind from the large pieces, and then I started putting together that typography. This is the full set, and this is them exhibited in typography conferences in my gallery in London, at the Type Directors Club 6 years ago, and the UPI gallery in Brooklyn. And these are the 10 extra letters that could also turn the font into a Greek font. These are my favorites: Delta and Omega, social criticism for the gaming world. Now would be the cell phone world if I ever revisited that series. In 2006, I was asked to do the cover for the 50th anniversary issue of Baseline magazine. This is one of the leading typography magazines out of London, and Stephen Heller wrote a lengthy article about my work named Typo Absurdo, another great title from Steve. And then I produced this little kind of collectible book. I think I made like 40 or 50 pieces, and it was completely sold out at Comic-Con 2009, and that was it for that. Foodfabet, that was, I thought, my ticket to the commercial world, and the beginning was from a cover that I did for the dining out section at the Times, Your Table's Almost Ready, and created that full alphabet. But the rumor has it that people like the food cooked, not raw. And I learned this, even though I love this alphabet, and this is my favorite piece. And I am still kind of experimenting with a pasta world of licensing, and we will see where that goes. And then we get to Warfabet, the absolute opposite. This is a completely editorial, anti-polemic statement, springboarded by that cover. That's a cover that was actually done in 6 hours. They called about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then I had to deliver it within 6 hours, late that afternoon. Thankfully, I have a large collection of gun photography at home. For some reason, I photograph everywhere I find them, and this also explains kind of the relationship with this aesthetic fascination that some of us have with weaponry, even though you hate the result or what they stand for. This is why there is always a deadly or negative comment melded in with the actual guns. F, S, and Z, looking at the crow sticking out of the tank barrel. This is the entire series, and this is the way they were exhibited. They were exhibited in the Irene Gallery in Nicosia, Cyprus. That is the demarcation line that splits the Greek and the Turkish part after the invasion. The other one is in the Königsberg Gallery in London, a very dear Carlos and Cleo showroom in my hometown of Thessaloniki, and then the Type Directors Club in 2012 over here. These pieces were also exhibited at the International Photography Festival in Athens, and at the end you see 3 large prints that I call warheads, and it's just 3 people doing gun business and negotiating actually maybe the next war and the retail part of it. So we have something that from inspiration from illustration, it becomes fine art, and then it becomes illustration again, because it was called up after the show in London. The Druth asked to use it on an entire journal themed around strategy. And if you don't know the Druth, that is the biggest poetry and literary journal in Scotland. The Zodiac Series. This series was done for no reason whatsoever, other than that I was trying to combine bits and pieces. I started, I stopped, I started again, and I knew that my 2012 TDC show was coming up and I wanted to show them, but I also started using a little more understated way of working. And as an example, this is Gemini, and the tween aspect is kind of very subdued, is not really in your face, but I'm also using this kind of multiply stamping kind of device as a comment, looking at twins as a multiplying effect of sorts. Artphabet, that series was completely developed for the ABCs of SVA. The piece Summer by Giuseppe Arciboldo, 1563, was sent to me by Stephen Heller. He goes, can you do something like this? And then we, instead of vegetables, we'll just put the toolbox, the art students or the art school's toolbox. I created the piece right next to the vegetables. We hated it equally, and then we said maybe we'll just go to typography. I also, kind of at the same time, I did that cover, How to Buy Contemporary Art, for the Wall Street Journal, but I couldn't use real pieces of contemporary art. I had to use pieces that look like they could be contemporary art and what isn't. So it was kind of very liberating to fake contemporary art. It gave me some experience in this. I created the sketch right next door that was approved. We changed the design a little bit, and then we created those 2 posters. And I told Steve, you know, I created the full alphabet. He said, okay, let's make a poster with a full alphabet as well. I had to create 2 O's because I didn't want them to be the same. And then I bring this closer. My studio is kind of plastered with these type drawers. And I also had our family initials in here for Nanette and Elio and Sivan. And that's just a little known secret. I was about to keep to my grave, but I just exposed it right here, right now. And then this is the way they were, it's not exhibited in the subways. They were just hanging in the subway. And then this lady kept on kind of posing next to my post. Oh wait, it's my mother. And she just happened to be there when I was in, and I'm very proud of her being very proud of me. So I thought I will include her here. Oh wait, my mother is here too. So that's another thing. It's good to feel at home even if you're very far away. And this was for the International Conference of Typography in Cyprus. They hung the entire alphabet from a preserved print shop out there where the conference was taking place. Cyphabet, this is where we're getting closer. And this is something that was actually finished just a few years ago. This is the first legitimate cover that I did with Steve that uses scientific typography, and maybe the first cover that really holds a cover, a full important area of a publication just with typography. And then since then I did it more, the future of robotic surgery, a sketch for Time Magazine for pain. I guess they found it too painful. The ABCs of medicine for Time Magazine again, and then Top Doctors 2013 for Philadelphia Magazine. And then I just start taking my collections from, this is the Air and Space Museum in DC, and that astronaut actually is a pilot, becomes part of the A, C. But you see, still the typography is really keeping within the confines of the definition of the letter. So they're keeping very close. That's Darwin's, the famous statue in the Museum of Natural History in London. At some point, I thought it's going to be D for Darwin, but as soon as you get to the middle of the alphabet, you just give up because you just want to do completely different things, and you're struggling for initials, and that's not the point. This, trust me, is a struggle enough by itself. And then using my favorite skulls, using effects like transparency and thunder in transparency, things that look like transformers. This is a very robust kind of M configuration. Again, really shiny transparency. And the challenge with Cyphabet is that I had to go against my nature that loves rust. But science and rust don't really go together, especially medicine and rust, I hope, still don't go together. And I had to clean up my act literally to actually do these scientific pieces. But some of them that were too good to change, I preserved for the next series that is still in progress. The aspect of liquidity comes in play here. And here's a letter that could also be something for the next project that I worked on. This is the full alphabet. This was the premiere at the International Conference for Typography in Thessaloniki, my hometown. And I put a big Greek head just to prove that it was in Greece. There was also a really successful workshop on typography happening at the same space after the opening. This is the typography exhibited at the Athens Science Festival in 2017, including some of the illustrations that I did for the science section at the time, because I illustrated very heavily there week in and week out. And then eventually that brings us to steampunkphabet, and I want to caution you, you should not attempt to say steampunkphabet in one breath. It's steam, you will choke. So you got to split. Steampunkphabet. We don't have insurance for this, so please follow the instructions. This is still works in progress. That means you can show anything you like. If people love it, you say it's done. If they don't, you're saying I'm still working on it. So, and this brings me to a collaboration with Irene Gallo at Tor. And this is one of the most amazing science fiction publishing houses. For some reason, in 2009, they trusted me with a 6-cover steampunk series that was first published in London, and you can see the cover. So we were kind of trying to almost be inspired by the cover in London. You never say copying. You always say inspired or a tribute to. It sounds much better. But the directions were to actually follow their visual line. I did the piece in the middle, and then Irene reminded me that steampunk also has a beautiful streak in its nature. It has a decorative streak in its nature. It has a colorful streak. So she said you can go steampunk crazy and rust crazy, but you also have to remember the element of beauty. So this was certainly great schooling for me, and this is our finalized cover, and it's still actually out there being sold. This is 2 more covers that we did for this series. Remember the gentleman on the time clock horse. He's also a piece in my newest series called Bestiaries, and this is a tintype. I was developing them at the same time, and in this case this is the centaur, so there's actually no head to the horse, but here is a full-blown developed horse. Both worked out, and by looking at the way this series was done, you can also see a lot of the inspiration also for the steampunk pieces. This is the series actually exhibited. It started as works in progress in 2011. Yes, it takes that long to develop such a series. It premiered at the Benaki Museum in Athens in 2015. It came to the UPI galleries in 2016 and went back to Athens with a full-blown colorful edition. All the pieces were built in color. So by having to make them in tintypes, we sacrificed the color, but I thought that the impact and the one-of-a-kindness of the tintype pieces was actually worth it. At the same time, I'm working on this bicycle project. It's a philanthropy exhibition every year, and all the proceeds for the sold posters go towards beautification of schools, and that year actually became the official poster for this. The next year I did something on that vein, and you can see the archival image that actually was the base for that piece, but also the sketch. And then this is the latest cover for the steampunk series. It's called The Revenant Express. These were the 2 sketches, and this is the final. The book is coming out in February of 2019, so it's just a few months away. But this segues into the research that I did for the steampunk series, and this is called actually The Plague Doctor. I know it looks very much like my teaching outfit, but it isn't. As soon as you see this person coming into your town, leave. You look at the old pieces, they are kind of Victorian. I did the sketches on those pathetic sketches on the side, are the only thing that I do before going to build something like this. And this was the first time that this is my work. I was actually so excited about this. I was the only one. But it did show me that it can actually develop in something real. The difference in this series vis-a-vis the other series is that these are all individual organisms. They're also a little freer from the confines of the contour of typography. So they might be a little harder to understand as far as which letter it is, but they still feel way more expressive, and they kind of help out being these autonomous tools, weapons, organisms, or characters. We start with P, but we will take a little run down the alphabet. This is based on an antique sextant that I photographed at the New York Public Library, and it seems to be kind of like a Victorian cosmonaut. I also need to bring up the fact that whatever I say is steampunk means is what I think is steampunk. It's what I think it's Victorian, because I have a very skewed understanding of things. I certainly haven't studied this enough, and I'm sure that a lot of steampunk and Victorian purists will be very upset. So this is Victorian with a K and not a C. So let's go with this. This was my first attempt for a B, based on a trinket that I bought at the flea market, but eventually I didn't want something so boxy, so went with a guy almost carrying a multimedia system on his imperial helmet. C comes from my obsession with still with toys and gears. 2 versions for D. I think I'm going with the one with the tussle. You can also see the faint character is way more pronounced on the final piece, because I thought that an anthropomorphic element will give more taste to the characters. The first edition of E, I thought it looks too much like my Wharfabet. So I made this, and then I thought this was too heavy, and I did this one that is almost like a Chitty Chitty Bang Bang version of Wall-E. And it's kind of playful and funny, and maybe I like it a little more. Maybe you can vote, and then we'll choose one of the three. F is a complete sci-fi vessel with all of the mechanism exposed. G is actually a very old industrial sewing machine with a set of pulleys and a poor octopus in the glass jar in there. I don't really know what this machine does, but I hope it does something. And two kind of preliminary versions of the H. You will see this configuration try to find her place in the alphabet, but eventually it doesn't. But you see from one to the next. But I went with something else for an H. I like the ludicrous weaponry that steampunk has, and we see these two editions. I also like that the weapon on its side registers less than a weapon, but maybe I will create a holster for it. I, that kind of became the flag for this series, again, really adhering to the advice about beauty and grace, versions of J, and from complication to simplicity, and back. Two versions of K. K gave me a very, very hard time, and eventually came up with this sideways typewriter version in order to have a one object instead of a collage of objects. This ridiculous steampunk motorcycle gave birth to something that is a little more graceful, and eventually turning into this. I'm using Vespa parts at the wheel aspect, so I actually had to do some weathering and rebuilding and retooling over there to stay true to the Victorian era. This is a Da Vinci-like flying machine, and I call it Time Flies because it has a clock and it flies. That old age is trying to disguise itself as an N, but I had a better N in mind, and shoes always win. O was left over from Cyphabet and has to do with animals and experiments on animals, so I just replaced the O over there and kept it for that. Then I had this cover for The Voice that actually gave birth to the 7th Sigma cover and eventually gave birth to Q over here. This flying contraption started with a head with a propeller nose. Then it became this jet engine egg beater. I don't know why we would need this. So eventually I tried to work it as an R, but I found a way more delicate configuration for the R, because when you have a lot of heavy letters, you're also looking for places to have something a little more sensitive, thin, and delicate. But it ended up being the @ sign, and I'm pretty happy with it. If you like it, it's done. If you don't, I haven't finished yet. S, and then we see ornamentation kind of sneaking into the typography as well. T. This looks like a very goofy smile, so I like that kind of duality to it. I was experimenting with like a Fiddler on the Roof project that eventually turned into a silkscreen print and became the inspiration for V, splitting the violin into two. W was pretty immediate. I love that dung beetle in the middle and created those prosthetics for it. X marks the point. This was a Wall Street Journal illustration about the end of the tracks for the business of trains, and then that double kind of steam engine came out of it. There's also no conductor. He didn't make it. Z was pretty immediate. I like the Zeppelin that actually can produce a flamethrower. And then I did numbers. The very strange thing with this series that I've been working on it for about 2 years, and then I was just completely out of love with it. And I said to myself, I don't know how I'm going to finish it. But then as soon as this show was booked and I had 6 months, I had two choices. I could finish what I had, or stupidly start doing new things that will never be finished on time. And stupid always wins. And I plunged into doing numbers because I felt a second wind that I thought should not be wasted in finishing something, and that worked out. That's number one, maybe commentary on the news or the perception of news. 7, that felt more comfortably as a 4, because this is what happened with 7. For some reason, I thought that a pipe that could be smoked by 3 people at the same time was a good idea, but it doesn't work. 6, and that's inspired by an old photographic lens. The 9 is inspired by the Edison pen. That this is a little known device that Edison came up as an electronic pen, but became the first tattoo gun. We did not use it for one, but it became the base for that. It's the first piece of tattooing equipment, and I created one again as best as I could. Nice and simple. The question mark, revisiting one of my old friends. And the %, that to me means there is much more to come. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. There is a slew of people that I have to thank for bringing this exhibition here. I want to thank Carl Hain, first of all, for coordinating this. I would love to thank Carol for being an amazing hostess and actually indulging me. I would like to thank Louise, my dear neighbor. I would love to thank my family, Ninette, the brains and the looks of the family, and my 2 children for actually bearing with me while I'm hiding upstairs, battling monsters. And these guys take as much work as they look like they take, and it's not easy sometimes, but things like this make it much, much easier. So I thank you very much. I will take questions. If you want to ask questions, ask them. Don't grab me later. I will be drinking wine to forget about this. So if we have any structural questions, any professional questions, any existential questions, please go ahead. I'm full of answers. Yes, ma'am.
How long does it take to complete this?
A series, a typography-only series will take from 2 to 3 years to make, but also it depends if there is an approaching deadline coming up. You really have to speed up and work more, but leisurely it would take 2 to 3 years. It could not be finished for less than 2, because there is an amazing amount of materials that you have to collect, and it takes years to collect it. So to either source it from my own photography files, go out and specifically photograph it, find stock or find royalty-free or public domain imagery that I can legitimately use takes a long, long time. But sometimes the research also brings inspiration, and it's wonderful that these are mostly personal projects, and I don't have to hurry them along, so they take as long as they take.
I love the opportunity to ask a question, and you can't move away. So there's, for me, kind of an otherworldliness to your work, and a futuristic component, obviously, but also a strong psychological component. Looking at your work, it's hard to maybe do that, but what would you say is the biggest influence you've had when you look at your work? And then if there's a walk-away theme as you look at your work, which you've just done, like what would be the message or theme that you see?
The theme of the work is really just turning a flashlight on in the darkest corner that we have. So this, I think, says kind of everything. Psychology is a big influence in my work because of projects, I had to study psychology, but also teaching brings a lot of psychology in, where you have to actually learn the inner workings of people's feelings, learn for them to be important to you, and see how to handle them and actually learn how to communicate things. That is pretty much psychology, and being someone that teaches a lot is something that I have to do almost day in and day out, managing your personal balances in relationships also is very related to psychology. So that's a very good observation. The outer worldly, I think it's described by the dark side. I just like the dark side. I find the light boring, but also very necessary. I also think that darkness is very necessary. In order to show light, you have to show darkness in order to compare it to. So I think it's a yin and yang in what we do, but I certainly don't create a lot of happy-go-lucky work. Maybe in another life, I will be punished to come back as a florist.
What's the process of printing? Like, how do you print this? Do you send it out to a printer?
Oh, this is a very good question, and actually reminds me to thank some more people, because the digital photography program at SVA was kind enough to actually run my large prints, and Tom is right here. And when I told him how much I have to print, he actually laughed on the phone, but said nothing. And that shows you that you got good friends even when you're becoming ridiculous. So they're digitally composed, so that part is easy. I learned that if you enlarge something a lot in layers, I enlarge the layers and then compact everything. For some reason, I feel it gives me great quality. And also, it's a masterful facility that they run out there, and great machine keeping and great paper and patience and being really a stickler for detail. Between Tom and Katrine, they kind of produce beautiful prints for me and saved me exactly when I had to be saved. So that's how it's done. It's cashing a lot of favors and goodwill.
I have a question.
Yes, my good sir.
Would you be comfortable with other people using these fine art or illustrated typos?
Using, yes. Abuse is what I am mostly afraid of. It's funny, they do, when you create fine art pieces, they do find application in illustration. I'm just negotiating kind of like a project that will be based in some of these. But it would be the usage by like a skillful art director and not someone, I mean, they're complex enough and they are built to occupy their environment. So I don't really think additives would kind of help, but it really depends. But collaborating is something that I like to do if there is a specific reason and something to accomplish, and somehow to push the work forwards. So yes and no, I guess.
Do you think of yourself as an artist or as an illustrator?
I think it's the same thing. I go upstairs and I make pictures, and some of them end up here, some of them end up there, and some of them end up in the garbage. And it's the way it is. It's lucky enough to be able to just go and just make little pictures every day that people either like or you're able to force them upon them. So it's kind of the same thing. Or even when I work with typography, with design or photography, look, I think it's kind of a blessing to be able to crowbar yourself in so many different industries that I don't separate them anymore. I can switch gears, or maybe I only have one gear, and people just accept what I do. But it's very confusing. The question is very, very good. If you ask every person in the room what they think I do, they would introduce me as something different, and there is very little I can do about it. I've learned to embrace that mess of a career that I'm living and kind of push forward to it. But I think at some point I found out that multi-layered artistic club sandwich that I am can really be included in a lot of menus. So I like that agility that gives me. Yes, young lady?
Out of everything you did, what was your favorite project?
My favorite project is the project I'm working right now. That's the project I'm in love with. That's the project
I cheat on my family with. That's the project that wakes me up in the morning, and that's what keeps me up late at night. And you are in love, and as soon as you're done with them. And then you start falling in love with something else, and that consumes you, and that's the only thing that makes you have the patience to put all of this work in here, and that's the way it is. I think when you hang an exhibition, it's called hanging for a reason. For me, this is almost a funeral, because these guys are done, and the works in progress will finish, and then I already have something in mind that I can't wait to actually sink my teeth into. But I know I'll wait, the time will come, and I will get in there. So my favorite project is the one at hand at that point. Yes, young gentleman.
How many pictures would you have to make one letter?
Okay, good question.
Can you repeat it? I haven't heard it in the back.
Can you repeat your question?
How many pictures would it have to take to make one letter?
Okay. I was also explaining to someone before, every screw is on a different layer. So you end up with 40, 50, 60, 70 layers. And there you have to include lighting effects and also shading. You also have to arrange, because all of these pieces were photographed under completely different conditions, and you have to match them through a preliminary light source in order for them to be believable, because believability and seamlessness is a big goal for these guys, in order for them to be accepted and give that nanosecond of what the hell is, oh, it's fake. So, but I want to use that immediate impact, and that takes a lot of layers, and it's difficult to remember how they're named. That's why I cannot really jump from one file to another, and I live for like 2 or 3 days because I know where to find things. It takes a long time to reconnect with a multi-layered file and kind of work in a good speed. So you have to immerse yourself into a file, because you sink so deeply as far as layers go. So it takes a few dozen pieces to make one of these, no matter how simple they are. If it takes less, I feel that something is wrong. So I don't feel like I'm involved enough. I didn't change my preliminary sources enough. And for me to really change what I took is very, very important in order to make this mine. Anyone else? Going once? Yes, ma'am? In the back, in the red sweater?
Have you copyrighted all this?
The work is protected, yes.